Hello, friends. Today's story is a longer one and it's a very interesting one. It's called The New Cap. Have you ever noticed that when something exciting happens, something else just as exciting is almost certain to follow afterwards? It all began with Ronnie's new cap. Caps at school cost 1 and 9 pence, and Mum had saved up for 3 weeks so that he could have a nice clean one for Sunday. Ronnie always wore one of the school caps. These caps were red and black and looked very nice indeed for a little while, though it was unlucky that they were inclined to run up the first time they were out in the rain. After that, the lining hung around your ears in bulges, and the cap stuck on the top of your head, looking rather silly. Well, then, on this particular autumn afternoon, when Ronnie brought home his cap, he found to his surprise that Mum had visitors. They were very important visitors too, no less than Uncle Stan and Aunt Addie, up from the country. Ronnie had never seen them before, although he had heard his mother speak of them often and often. As a matter of fact, Mum was rather proud of them, for Uncle Stan was a farmer. As a rule, Ronnie and Rennie began to get ready for bed soon after Dad had finished his tea. This, however, was rather awkward when there were visitors, since Ronnie's bed was on the sofa in the kitchen. Tonight, therefore, since the grown-ups wanted to talk, Mum put Rennie's to bed and told Ronnie he could go out and play in the street for a little while. This was most exciting. The little boy had often heard the fine tales other boys told at the school of their adventures in the street after dark. As he went out, however, he did a very silly thing. Mum was anxious and busy, so he picked up his new cap and put it on, although he knew quite well this would never be allowed in the ordinary way. Down in the street it was getting rather dark. It blew cold. Ronnie had rather expected to find dozens of boys playing, but no one was there. He ran down to call for Billy Barrett, but Billy was getting ready for bed and looked out of an upstairs window in great surprise. "Why, Ron," he said, "what are you doing out, and why have you got your new cap on? Does your mum know?" Ronnie said nothing about the cap, but told Bill about the visitors. "Can't you come out a little while?" he begged. "No good asking," answered Billy. "I'm nearly in bed." "All right, Mum," he called to an impatient voice inside. Then, "Good night, Ron," and down went the window with a slam. Ronnie was left alone wearing his fine new cap in the dreary empty street. He whistled sadly for a little and then had a very great idea. Auntie Glad's father was a watchman, one of those who sit at night in a little hut with a bright brazier of coke to keep them warm. His business was to light orangey red lamps and set them around holes in the road where workmen had been busy during the day. At this particular time, Mr. Goss was in a quiet street just past the school. Ronnie knew that he could go and sit in the hut for a little while and talk, so long as he took no other boys with him. Mr. Goss had always been very good to him. The point was, should he go and ask permission first, and perhaps leave his new cap in the house? If Uncle Stan and Aunt Addie were gone, Mother would want him to come in. If, on the other hand, they were still there, she might think he was coming to hang around and worry, as children sometimes do there, when there are visitors and they feel curious. He went slowly down the street and stood for a minute outside number 88. The door was shut and all was quiet. Mr. Bobby would be having his tea, and of course it isn't manners to go into someone else's kitchen when the father is having tea. Otherwise, Ronnie could have gone in there to ask about the visitors. He stood for a few minutes with one foot in the gutter and one on the curb, whistling his funny little whistle and looking at the house. Then he made up his mind. He put his cap carefully into a pocket and set off briskly down the street. He had to pass the school. It looked very queer in the dusk. There were lights in some of the rooms high up in the building, and a dismal old gas jet was burning in a lantern above the gate. Ronnie wondered to see it, for it wasn't lighting up anything. But as he looked at it, a very big girl with nice rosy cheeks and carrying a case in her hand turned in at the gate. "It must be evening schools," said the little boy to himself. "Fancy going to school at night when you don't have to. I suppose we can't go into the playground now." He peered in through the gate and decided that he didn't want to go in anyhow. It was dark and shadowy and draughty. He turned away to pass up the street to where Mr. Gosse was setting up his lamps for the evening. He had gone not more than a step or two when his arms were suddenly wrenched at from behind. A very grubby hand came round his neck in a nasty choking way, finally catching hold of his mouth. Of course he kicked out and struggled hard, and went down upon the pavement, tangled up with what seemed to be half a dozen other boys, shouting and whooping, and as Ronnie knew straight away, playing gangster. Frank Simmons and his friends had been lying in wait behind the pillars of the school gate, and they had caught him unawares. He was much smaller than they were, but he cried out angrily and wriggled hard, so that a man passing by in the dusk called out, "Here you! Stop that fighting there! Do you hear?" But he didn't wait to see his orders carried out. Like most boys, when they have played a trick of that sort, the gang were all feeling a bit silly by this time. Some of them were wearing goggles from Jutesworth, and Frank had pulled his cap over one eye and had tied a very dirty handkerchief round his head so that it hung down over his nose and mouth. He looked worse than ever. One boy tried to put a pair of toy handcuffs on Ronnie, but they wouldn't work or something, and he soon stopped. The gang then drew off a little, trying to think of what to do next. There were only 4 of them after all. Now was the time that Frank, as captain, had to invent something fresh to keep his followers excited and interested. I should not wonder if he had been thinking out this new adventure for some days. Anyhow, he made up his mind that this was the moment to try it. When Master Frank was bent on a piece of mischief, one of the meanest of all his mean tricks was to try and get other boys so mixed up in it that he was able to put the blame off himself. Sometimes it would be a boy in his own gang, one of the weak and silly ones, of course, but more often it would be a poor innocent outsider like Ronnie. He had a way of bursting into tears and sobbing and howling and pretending to shiver with fear, and saying all the time that other boys had led him into temptation. Almost any grown-up who did not know him could be taken in this way. It was surprising that he could always get plenty of chums to go about with him, but so it was. It was a fine piece of work that he had in his mind this night, I must say. The school had a hall that was built separately from the rest of the high building. It was built away at the side next to the playground shed and had a roof made partly of glass so that the light could come in from above. What Frank wanted to do was to range over this roof with his gang, play burglars or some other fine thing, and peeping down, maybe at the girls in the evening school dancing and drilling. The first thing to do was to get Ronnie up there as well. The little boy was trying to edge away. "You let me alone," he said. His precious new cap was lying on the pavement, and he made a snatch at it and got ready to run. Frank Simmons growled out in his best gangster way. Only his voice went squeaky at the end. "No, you don't," and advanced his ugly little face twisted into a hideous scowl until it was only a few inches from Ronnie's. "Stop it," said Ronnie, and backed a little more. "You dastardly cur," the big boy went on. Of course he got that bit from the story in Snooky Snips. "We've not done with you yet, have we?" he asked, turning to his gang, who smiled in a sickly, silly sort of way. "What do you mean, I want to know," he continued, "by going round the streets in a new cap?" As he spoke, he grabbed Ronnie's cap from his hand and threw it up the high school wall onto the roof of the shed which adjoined it. Ronnie gave a cry of horror as it disappeared, and he thought of his mother's carefully saved 1 and 9 pence. Tears rushed from his eyes as he stood there helplessly. "Now," said Frank in his nastiest way, "if you want your old cap, you can go and fetch it." "Here," said Billy Rogers. He is a pale, lanky member of Frank's gang, very easily frightened. "Supposing someone comes." "Oh," said Frank, "and suppose they do. Now, Ron Turner, who was it that pushed our Teddy in the park, eh? You did?" "I didn't," asked Ronnie. "Yes, you did. And now I think of it, I'm going to put that cap down the chimney." Then, before any of the boys could move, he had turned to a great iron drain pipe which ran down the outside of the school wall and began to swarm up it. You must not think that Ronnie, even though he was not allowed to roam the streets at night, had no pluck of his own. When he heard what Frank said and saw the bad boy halfway up the drain pipe, his tears dried in a sudden flare of anger. Before any of the gang could move a finger, he sprang at the pipe and was up the wall, over the broken glass at the top, and onto the sloping roof of the playground shed beyond. Dimly, he knew that the other boys were following him, but his only idea was to get back his cap. He saw Frank pick it up and hold it in his hand as he continued to climb towards the crest of the shed roof. He had no notion that the younger boy had followed him, for he called back quite cheerfully and confidently, "Come on, Bill, it's fine up here." Indeed, it was exciting in a way. The shadows were queer and dark, and the roof seemed very large and rough. "Whatever will happen if we knock some tiles loose?" wondered Ronnie. Frank seemed to have forgotten his plan of putting the cap down the chimney. Ronnie saw him thrust it into his braces. He always wore his braces outside a thick jersey and had very big baggy trousers. He then moved on cautiously. The little boy set his teeth and followed, scraping his knees in the darkness and once putting his hand on a lost ball lodged in the gutter. Behind him swarmed the other boys. He could hear them muttering. They came presently to a level space covered with lead, then a coping and a stiff piece of wall. This was a difficult scramble, but Frank seemed to be made of India rubber and made no trouble of it. Ronnie hesitated, but again remembering his cap, he struggled up somehow. Not so the rest of the gang. He heard them stop below, and one or two of them called softly to Frank to come back. They are afraid, thought Ronnie in surprise. They are a fine gang. They are afraid to follow, and I wasn't. They were now on the roof of the great hall. He could see Frank Simmons quite plainly. Lights were lit and were shining through the skylights. Long rows of these there were, partly open and covered with wire netting. The big boy was leaning forward on his hands and staring intently down into the hall below. Very, very cautiously, Ronnie moved towards him. Frank did not turn his head, but said in a hoarse whisper, no doubt still believing that it was Bill Rogers behind him, "Here, look." Still nearer came the little boy until he could have touched Frank's poor old broken shoes. He caught a glimpse of big girls in gym tunics and white blouses dancing away in the bright hall below, and heard the tinkle of a piano, but it was so far down that he dare not look again. Indeed, he had to lie still for a moment, tightly digging his fingers into the wire netting that covered the skylight. A dreadful feeling swept over him that although he had come so far, he would never be able to get back. It soon went off though. Now Frank was getting ready to move farther on. He pulled himself carefully to his feet, dusting his hands as though he were fussy about them, and gave his cap a good pull down over one ear. Ronnie saw his own cap stuck in the big boy's braces, and suddenly said to himself desperately, "I must get it now. He's going." It was just as though the idea set working a spring in Ronnie, a spring that he did not know was there. The awful thought that he might follow Frank over roof after roof only to lose his cap in the end was too much. He quite forgot that his enemy did not know he was there. He almost forgot that they were perched dangerously high on the roof. He pulled himself up on to his knees and demanded in a fierce, whispering sort of growl, "You give me that cap." At the same moment he made a quick grab at the boy's braces, and more by good luck than anything else, his fingers closed over the cap and pulled it free. He did not bargain for what followed, however. His attack had been so unexpected that Frank staggered and waved his arms wildly to save his balance on the slope of the roof. As he did so, he stepped backwards right onto one of the skylights. They argued afterwards that the glass must have been already cracked, but however that may be, it shivered and splintered under the boy's weight and fell with a tinkle into the hall below. There was a scream from one of the dancers. Then the wire tore away from the rusty nails, and you would have said that that was the end of Frank, his daredevil tricks, his gang of silly boys, and all the rest, if it had not been for his braces. I wonder how many teachers had sent him to put them inside his jersey. How many mothers in Palgrave Street had remarked on them in scandalized tones. But they served him well now, for as he crashed through the netting, they caught on a jutting bar and held him suspended in the roof, arms and legs sprawling and helpless, swinging to and fro and squawking miserably. What a position for the daring captain of the Palgrave Street gang! There was a running to and fro among the girls on the hall floor, so far below. They were calling shrilly to each other and clustering below the spot where Frank was hanging, but neither boy noticed any of that. Ronnie shivered with fear, tried to thrust his arms down through the broken pane, but Frank was beyond his reach. Then he saw with horror that the buttons at the back of Frank's trousers were slowly but surely tearing away. Each tiny swing they gave a little more. Every squirm of the little poor victim, and a rather bigger patch of white lining appeared, till only a few threads were between him and the awful drop. He still struggled, but nothing came to grasp of his outstretched grubby hands. If he could have reached anything, he would have been out on the roof again in a twinkling. At last he made a convulsive effort to twist himself round and catch the bar that held him. There was a ripping sound, and one button pulled off completely. The other, but it was more than Ronnie could bear. He turned and fled away. That fled the way he had come, over the hall roof, down the wall, along the gutter of the shed, so to the drain pipes, into the street. Not a soul was there. The dull light was still flickering above the school gate, but from the distance far beyond, where the school wall ended, came a steady warm glow. Mr. Goss's brazier. Ronnie was breathless and panting from his fright and the rush over the roofs, but he turned somehow and ran towards it. He had his new cap still clutched in his hand. "Well, if it doesn't beat everything," said Mr. Goss, as the boy gasped out his story. "Did you see him fall?" asked Mr. Goss. "He was just going to. Oh, do you think he's killed?" "He's been in too many of these scrapes to get killed easily," answered the watchman. However, he got up as he spoke and knocked out his pipe. "Now you stay here. Don't go away, mind. I'll just step down to the school and see what happened." Ronnie sat still, though he shivered at every footstep that passed the hut. No one came near him, however. Neither did any voice call loudly for him to come out and be taken to the police station. It seemed hours till Mr. Goss came back. Perhaps it was about 15 or 20 minutes. When he did appear, though, he was smiling broadly. "Is he hurt?" asked Ronnie anxiously. "Not a morsel as far as I can see. He's sitting up and eating chocolate and telling the young ladies in the evening school how he went on the roof to rescue a poor little kitten that couldn't get down." "Kitten? There wasn't any kitten." "No, of course there wasn't a kitten," said Mr. Goss. "He seems as though he must tell lies somehow. Poor chap, I suppose he hasn't much of a chance. Is your cap spoilt?" They looked at it in the light of the lantern, but as far as they could see, there was little damage done. "But how was it he wasn't hurt, Mr. Goss?" Ronnie asked presently. "Oh, it was pretty sharp of the young ladies. There was a big map of the world in the corner of the hall, and they unrolled it and held it under where he was hanging. When he dropped, that broke his fall, and there were some jumping mats as well." "Our big map?" "I guess so. You won't use it much again, anyhow. He went clean through America. I wonder what they'll say in this morning when they see it," said Ronnie reflectively. "I shouldn't bother about that now. You get home to your mum. Good night." "Good night," and Ronnie scampered home. I hope you liked that story. I'll be here with another one for you tomorrow. Bye bye.